What's going on, YouTube? How are you guys doing? Welcome to episode 2 of Rocket Talks. And in this episode, we will be covering rocket engine nozzle designs. And in this specific video, we'll actually be going over some of the more general and basic terms and concepts about what all rocket engine nozzles and engines themselves actually kind of base their performance and overall design off of. We'll be covering the parts of a rocket engine, basically how a rocket engine achieves thrust. We'll also be going over the thrust equation and pretty much what the thrust equation, how it actually dictates the performance of a rocket engine nozzle. We'll also be going over specific impulse and what it actually means, what actually specific impulse means. We'll also be going over different rocket engine operating conditions. That's going to be in terms of actually operating on design point versus off of a rocket engine's design point. And we'll also be actually showing a couple of YouTube videos showing some examples of what we're actually going to be covering today. And then finally, we're going to, of course, have a little bit of Kerbal Space Program fun, actually using a mod in Kerbal Space Program to kind of show and iterate on some of the concepts that we're going to be covering today. So the first concepts that we're going to be covering today are the parts of the rocket engine, a typical rocket engine, and pretty much going to start discussing on how a rocket engine is actually capable of achieving thrust. So if we look at this first picture here, this is just a picture of a generic bell-shaped engine nozzle, right? And all different types of rocket engine designs, whether they're aerospikes or expansion deflection nozzles, plug nozzles, or even bell-shaped or conic nozzles, they all use the same exact principle that we're going to be covering right now. So this is just your generic bell-shaped nozzle. Now, the nozzle produces thrust by converting thermal energy from the hot combustion chamber gas products, right? So we have all this fuel and oxidizer starting to flow into your combustion chamber, and they're ignited. Now, when they're ignited, all these gases want to rapidly expand, and they're very, very hot, right? So your rocket engine nozzle converts this thermal energy into kinetic energy by using this gas dynamic principle of hot expanding gases. So the exhaust from the combustion chamber actually gets pushed into this throat region. And this throat region is a converging section, right? And so it actually wants to compress all of your hot, rapidly expanding gases into a very, very small amount of area. So you have all of this expanding gas that just wants to go out as fast as it can out of this enclosed space. And it goes through the path of least resistance, right? And the path of least resistance in this case, if your rocket engine is designed well, it will go through the open end of the rocket engine nozzle, right? That makes sense. So it wants to go through the throat, and your throat, because it has a smaller cross-sectional area than the rest of the engine, all of your gases are compressed into high-pressure gas. So after your hot expanding gases go through the throat section, they now enter the diverging section of the nozzle, the actual bell-shaped curve that you see at the bottom right below the throat, right? That's the actual nozzle itself. So the nozzle gradually increases in cross-sectional area, right? As further down you go, the further down the nozzle you go, the more it actually, the bigger it actually gets, right? It's a diverging section, it expands. So the nozzle, because it gradually expands in cross-sectional area, it allows the gases to expand, and when they expand in this volume, they're actually pushing up on the rocket. So now you have all this hot expanding gases trying to expand outward, and they're actually pushing against the nozzle wall. And because the nozzle wall diverges in such a way, you're actually able to achieve a pushing effect that you're getting thrust out of this. You're getting thrust out of this transfer of kinetic energy. So the whole mathematical purpose of a rocket engine nozzle, right? How it actually produces thrust and how efficiently it produces thrust. The ultimate purpose of the nozzle is to expand the gas as efficiently as possible, isentropically, what's known as isentropic expansion. And this is to maximize the exit velocity. So why is maximizing the exit velocity important? Well, that actually involves the rocket engine thrust equation. So this is the rocket engine thrust equation. The m dot E is the mass flow rate going out the end of the nozzle, and then V subscript E is the exit velocity of your combustion products, right? So that first term is the momentum of your combustion products, right? So you have all this expanding gas rapidly going out of your nozzle. That's producing thrust. That makes sense. Now, what is this second term in the rocket engine thrust equation? That is actually there as a leaching term for your rocket engine nozzle due to pressure differentials across your exit nozzle, or the exit of your nozzle in the ambient environment. So what does all that even mean? So this second term, this PE minus PA, which is your exit pressure minus your ambient pressure, times the exit area of your nozzle, that term dictates the whole reason why nozzles or rocket engines are more efficient in higher altitudes than they are in lower altitudes. Because if you actually look at that term, when you're at sea level, your ambient pressure is actually larger than the exit pressure of your rocket engine nozzle. So that second term is actually negative. So you actually get a decrease in thrust at lower altitudes, at sea level. However, as you actually increase in altitude, right, your PE starts to become equal to your ambient pressure, to your PA. So when PE equals PA, that's actually called your design point optimal condition, right? Your rocket engine is working at its most optimal condition because the nozzle is expanding the gases perfectly to meet ambient conditions. That's the optimal way that gases can expand. So you're not losing any thrust. So this is like the actual perfect environment that your rocket engine nozzle is designed to actually operate at. And so that's when you get that second equation where now your thrust is just equal to the amount of stuff coming out of your nozzle. You don't have a leaching term for your pressure. So you need to actually now keep in mind this equation. And what we're actually going to be talking about next is specific impulse. Now, make sure that you keep in mind that equation, right? That rocket thrust equation is going to be important when we start discussing overexpanded flow, underexpanded flow, and design point conditions. And we'll be getting into all that in a minute. But I get a lot of questions when I'm streaming about what is ISP? What is specific impulse? And quite literally, the definition of specific impulse is the amount of thrust you get per weight of propellant that you burn per unit of time. In more layman's terms, you can really think of ISP as miles per gallon, as like fuel efficiency for a car. The higher that number is, the more efficient your propellant, or the more efficient your rocket engine burns propellant to achieve thrust. So it's just a way to characterize how fuel efficient your rocket is. Now, ISP is important because it actually fits into your thrust equation that we have right there, right? It actually fits into the thrust equation because we have that F term, that force, that thrust term in the ISP equation, right? So you can actually manipulate the ISP equation to actually be able to fit ISP into your force equation, into your thrust equation. Now, it's important to note here that ISP is equal to your exhaust velocity divided by gravity. Now that gravity is 9.81, whether you're here, on the moon, on Mars, it doesn't matter. G here is always constant, always Earth's gravity acceleration value, and it's always 9.81. But you can actually fit ISP here in terms of VE in that lower equation, in that equation that we have right there, right? So you can actually fit ISP into that equation. So what does that mean? So just like we lose thrust at sea level in comparison to operating under design point condition or even in a vacuum, we lose ISP in the exact same way. Rocket engines are less fuel efficient at lower altitudes at sea level than they are in a vacuum, and that kind of that actually shows it right there, that we can now convert ISP and put it into the thrust equation and actually show that we actually lose thrust, or if we keep thrust constant, we lose ISP in terms of altitude. Moving on to our next topic here, we're going to actually be covering the different conditions that a rocket engine actually goes through, both during startup and actually operating, like actually its flight, right? So when a rocket starts flying, we're going to actually be covering what the different cycles that the rocket engine actually goes through as it's operating. So you see here on that picture, we actually have, this is a typical rocket engine startup sequence. So basically, picture A at the top there is showing you that as soon as propellant starts getting combusted in the combustion chamber, you don't have a choked flow at your rocket engine nozzle. So when you have a slow moving gas coming out of your nozzle, you're not producing a lot of thrust at all. So After you have this startup sequence where all of your combustion products are now starting to move through the throat, you now get choked flow at the throat. And so we're starting to get where we want, right? However, at this point, we still have subsonic flow downstream of our nozzle, right? Or downstream of our throat. We actually, remember, we still want that speed to increase. So at this point, you actually start to get a shock wave traveling down your rocket, which is not good. You don't want this. This is actually a dangerous sort of section of operation that your nozzle goes through. When you actually have choked flow moving in a shock wave down your nozzle, you can have so much combustion instabilities, and we'll actually show a video in a moment about this actually occurring in the shuttle main engine. You can actually see the entire shuttle main engine just wobble in and out and flexing, and it's really kind of insane. Now, the first operating condition is known as overexpanded flow, and that's where our shock wave that was once inside our nozzle is now starting to get pushed outside of our nozzle exit. So you can actually see this in a lot of different places, right? Overexpanded flow causes mock diamonds and shock cones to be seen inside of whether it's a jet engine exhaust or even like the shuttle main engine at sea level. You can actually see this phenomenon occur. You can actually see the shock wave in the rocket plume. It's called overexpanded flow because a rocket engine nozzle is actually taking our combustion products, our hot expanding gases, and it's actually expanding them past the point of reaching atmospheric pressure. Remember, the whole point of a rocket engine nozzle is to isentropically expand the gases to reach your ambient conditions. However, in this case, our ambient pressure, our atmospheric pressure is larger than what our expansion gases inside of our nozzle are actually achieving. So we're overexpanding our gases. And you can see that here with that thrust equation, right? So we have that thrust equation, same one on the top, and in this case, we actually have our ambient pressure being larger than our exit pressure. So that's not good. We're experiencing a lot of, reduced thrust in ISP at sea level for a lot of rocket engine designs. But at every point in a rocket engine's flight, you reach at some point the design condition. Now, the design condition is the point where a rocket engine is actually designed to operate at its most optimal performance, meaning that your rocket engine is actually expanding the gases perfectly to ambient conditions, and you have all of your flow exiting straight out the back of the nozzle in the direction that you're actually flying, which is, however, at a certain point, you get past the design condition. So this happens a lot for like first stage rocket engines, right? So like if you actually look at, and we'll be looking at this in a moment, we'll actually be looking at the Merlin 1D on the Falcon 9. At some point, you will actually achieve underexpanded flow where now your gases inside the nozzle aren't actually able to be expanded out all the way to the ambient conditions. This usually happens, this happens pretty much at some point for every single rocket engine nozzle, whether it's upper stage, vacuum engine, or even a core stage engine, first stage engine. There's really no way to get around this because the type of nozzle required to perfectly expand all of your hot gases to be at the pressure of your ambient vacuum conditions, it requires such an enormously long, what's called an ideal nozzle. It has to be so long in order to achieve that perfect expansion that it just doesn't make it practical, because now you're talking about added mass for a very, very large nozzle, and so it's just not actually practical to have that. So going back to the design condition there, that's actually operating at where PA equals PE. So that's how you achieve that next, that F equals M dot E times VE. That's how you basically get that terminology. You now have, perfect expansion, your engine's operating at its most ideal environment. Now for underexpanded flow, you actually have PA greater than PE. However, even in this sort of regime where you do theoretically get more thrust out of your rocket engine nozzle because now that second term is positive, you actually experiences different losses because now you're actually having your expansion, your gases are expanding much further and not actually traveling in the direction of your motion, right? So you're actually losing some, you're not gaining as much thrust as that term actually, kind of shows that we're getting. All right, so let's actually look at an example of a rocket engine taking off at sea level, right? So this is going to be an example of overexpanded flow. So this is a space shuttle main engine, and this is during its startup sequence, right? So like right now, our flow is still subsonic, and eventually there's going to be a shock starting to form down the side of the rocket engine nozzle. So if we actually look at this here, start to play it, you will actually be able to see the shock start to come down the rocket engine nozzle. So let's see if we can't see it here. There it is. It's starting to move down the inside of the rocket engine nozzle. It is now at the exit of your rocket engine nozzle, and now that shock wave is getting pushed outside of the rocket engine nozzle, and now you have your shock disc, or your shock cone, right? And you can actually see the shock disc form right there. So that actually happens really, really quickly, right? This is on startup. This is at super, super slow-mo, and I even have this video at like half speed. So this happens very, very quickly. So if we actually show this again, you can actually see the entire SSME, the entire Space Shuttle main engine, completely flex and deflex as the shock actually goes outside of the rocket engine. So watch the actual flexing of this engine here. So there's the shock. It starts to get pushed outside. Now watch what the engine actually does. It's very, very interesting. It's also kind of worrisome, right? There you go. You can actually see it's flexing in and out, almost like it's breathing. And that's because of all the flow instabilities that are occurring with the shock wave flowing through the nozzle. Now let's look at an entire rocket throughout its entire flight, right? So we're going to start with SpaceX. This is CRS-11, which launched June 3rd in 2017. And we're going to actually be able to see and walk through the entire flight regime that a rocket engine nozzle for a core stage actually goes through. So we'll start at overexpanded flow on takeoff, and then we'll go higher into the atmosphere to where we'll actually hit our design point, and then we'll continue flying until we actually achieve underexpanded flow. So if we go through this here, let's go ahead and start it up. So right now the vehicle is in startup sequence, and there it goes. Engines are lit, everything happens very, very quickly. You now have over expanded flow, right? And you can actually see it as the camera zooms out. So as you can see it here, all of your gases are in a straight line, and if it zooms out far enough, you can actually see that everything is actually tailoring in. So your expanding gases want to expand outward, but because of the pressure of the atmosphere pressing in on the gases, they don't have anywhere to go. So you actually just get kind of an expansion that actually tailors in on itself again. Now this is around 12 kilometers, so we're starting to reach the design point that the Merlin 1D engines are designed for, right? Because now you can actually see the gases are starting to expand outward, and most of your expansion is going with the direction of flow, with the direction of your velocity, right? So the vehicle is traveling upward at this direction. All of your expanding gases, there's not too much expansion outward. It's all going directly in line with your rocket engine nozzle. So right around 20 kilometers, you're going to start to see some examples of under-expansion, where now we're actually looking at a flight regime that's outside of our design point, actually above our design point. Okay, so at 35 kilometers here, you can see that the rocket engine exhaust plume is just going straight, almost straight out in a very, very large plume. All of your gases are now expanding outward because your rocket engine nozzle is not able to expand them enough to reach the ambient conditions, just because the rocket engine nozzle is not designed to be optimal at this flight condition. So here we are in Kerbal Space Program, and we're going to do the exact same thing that SpaceX just did on their launch to actually show the different regimes in a rocket engine's flight, but in KSP. So now the stock game doesn't actually model under-expansion and over-expansion at all. However, there is a mod called Real Plume Effects that you can actually download and implement into the game that actually shows and models rocket engine plumes actually pretty well. So this is our Falcon 9 analog, and we're going to be launching today a Dream Chaser. We have a Dream Chaser loaded up inside here into the payload fairing, and what we're going to be doing is going up, releasing it, and then we're going to try and land the first stage as well. And we're going to hopefully be able to see all of the different regimes that a rocket engine goes through during flight. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and do this in 3, 2, 1. So at the moment right now, since we're at low altitudes, we have overexpansion, right? So our rocket exhaust plume is still really compact. All the pressure, all the ambient pressure of the atmosphere is pushing in on those gases, keeping them from expanding outward. So this is an example of overexpansion. If we zoom in here, you can really see that pretty well, right? The gases are pretty much just going straight out the nozzle. They're not able to really expand at all. However, as we start to continue flying upward, we should be able to see them start to expand outward until we actually get to MECO, secondary stage separation, and all that good stuff. So, as we start to continue down here, you can actually see a real plume effect start to take hold. Our gases are actually starting to now expand outward as we actually climb into the atmosphere and get out of the thicker, dense atmosphere. So you can actually see it here. Just watch the plume, the plume of the exhaust, and you can actually start to see it's actually expanding outward. So this is what real plume stock effects actually does, and it's actually really cool. It actually is able to model somewhat realistically the effects that a real engine plume actually, or a real rocket engine actually goes through. And you can actually see at this point our rocket engine is now expanding a lot more than what we actually had at the very beginning. So we're almost to the point where we need to start separating and looking for a boost back maneuver. Alright, so let's call MECO in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So main engine shutdown, and we have separation. There we go, looks good. Flip to our second stage here and actually start, let's go ahead and blow that and also get this going. So with this upper stage engine, you can actually see it much clearer, right? All the gases are now actually going into an overexpansion, an underexpansion, right? The gases are actually now expanding so far outside the nozzle because the nozzle isn't actually able to expand the gases coming out of the nozzle to atmospheric conditions, which in this case is actually, near vacuum. So now that this is on its way, and you can actually see it's the Dream Chaser, let's go ahead back to our core stage and see if we can't get this back to KSC. So there's a boost back burn, and you can actually see it on here that the gases are actually expanding really far. Somewhere about there seems good. And I will see you once we're lined up for a landing. Alright, so we're lined up here for a nice easy landing, RTLS style, back at KSC, back at the Kerbal Space Center. So let's go ahead and see if we can't get this lined up for a good landing, and if we actually can land this SpaceX style. So we have our single engine on for our landing burn. It doesn't look like we're going to need a re-entry burn too much. We're not actually going that fast through re-entry here. So everything's looking good. Right now I'm just using the cold gas thrusters and our actual grid fins here to kind of maneuver us while we're going through the atmosphere at a decent landing spot. So that looks like a pretty good trajectory right about there. In fact, let's actually kind of kick us over a little bit in that direction. There we go, that looks pretty good. So we can actually go ahead and turn those off. We don't need the cold gas thrusters anymore. And you can see our trajectory point right there. Alright, so let's go ahead and see just exactly what we can do with this landing point. So we're going to start looking for our landing burn and hope that everything goes well here. So that looks pretty good. We can actually throttle down. We started it just a little bit too soon, but that's okay. Go ahead and deploy the landing gear. Well, that's definitely a Kerbal way to land it, but we did it. We did it nonetheless. So anyways, guys, that is going to do it for me for the first part here of episode 2. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Definitely that really kind of not super great landing, but we landed it, so it's all good, and the payload did in fact reach orbit. So guys, that's going to do it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video here. There will be others, to continue the episode 2. So I hope to see you guys later.